stage, controlling minds like a hive. And when I shine a light on the lies, what I find is a play on a stage, controlling minds like a hive. When I was young, I believed what they told me.
Welcome to Tending the Threshold. My name is Jaime Powell. I'm the founder of Transformative Arts Collaborations, and I'm delighted to present this multi-part series where we take a really in-depth look at the times that we're inhabiting. I want to introduce you to my co-host. This is Holly Truhlar, who is a lawyer and a grief therapist. And to begin our show today, Holly, would you be willing to just say a word about the times that we're in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. One of the things that feels important as we address this question is to do a territorial acknowledgement and really acknowledging that we are occupiers on Tequilma and Shasta territory in what's so-called Ashland. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because I think it does indicate the times that we're in, which are unprecedented times, accelerated times, times where we're starting to really look at colonization and what that means. Some people call this time period the Anthropocene. Mm-hmm. Some people call it late stage capitalism. We're looking at systems collapse and a lot of unprecedented, scary things happening. And so really what we're doing here with this series is asking people to step into the largest conversation of our times. And to me, that's a conversation of how we can come together as things fall apart.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I want to also go into a little bit about identity, and I want to thank you also for bringing this topic to my consciousness. And so if you'll say just a word about identity, and perhaps we can talk about who each other is in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I've looked at the times that we're in, part of what feels important is really looking at what are systems of domination and what are places that we're being oppressed or where we're oppressing people. So there's this question I like to ask, which is, what identities do you lead with? Mm-hmm. And I ask that question because it's really important to look at where we inhabit a dominant identity so that we can dismantle the privilege that we have, and then where we might have a marginalized or oppressed identity so that we can celebrate that and bring that to the forefront and bring the wisdom of that marginalized self in. So yeah. I'm going to ask you the question, Jaime, what identities do you lead with?
Thank you for asking. I'm so grateful for your asking, because what I'm realizing is that several of the identities that I lead with are of the dominant culture. Mm. And the first time that you asked me, I remember just being really discombobulated because one of the features of the dominant culture is that it doesn't actually have to know that it's dominant. And so that's what I'm learning. So the identity that I lead with is being a white woman, cisgendered, so the same gender as the sex I was born with, and upper middle class as well, able-bodied. And I also do lead with the identity of being an artist, a performer, transformative artist, and a friend, a sister, things like that. So thank you for asking the question, because before you asked, I was able to just kind of be invisible. And I'm learning more and more that when I can answer that question, it allows me to see the diversity that actually surrounds me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it can be a really vulnerable thing to share our identities. And yeah. I also really want to credit two women that have taught me a lot, which is Desiree and Adrienne Marie Brown, who have both brought up this question and this exploration in different ways for me. And for me, the identities that I lead with are being white-bodied, and also being a woman, and cis, mostly hetero. I would say that sister, friend are both big ones for me, and also a community organizer, communitarian, that's really important to me. I'm the guardian of some animals, and that's an important thing to me. And then I also do identify as a lawyer and a transpersonal therapist who specifically work with grief and a lot of grief work around being in dominating systems and living in domestication.
Yeah, thank you so much. So when we speak to the times that we're in, and that for me, that kind of speaks to the macrocosm of where we are, and then the microcosm is our identity. One of the things that fascinates me about your work is the radical attunement work, the raw model. And so now in the show, we're going to move into describing this model because for me, it gave a way to move with sanity and clarity through these times. And I was noticing around me either people responding, since the election, the past presidential election, really being alarmed for lots of things that are being revealed, and either going full throttle into activism work and wearing themselves out, or going into spiritual bypass and just denying, the realities that exist. And so that was part of what I was so excited about working with you. And so I'm going to just hand the floor over to you to describe this model.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to just bring the model up on the screen and do a quick overview of it and just walk through pretty quickly each of the steps, and then we'll go over it in more detail in a minute. And I'll also talk a little bit about how it came to be. Yeah. But the first thing is this is a model that moves us from a place of domination and exploitation with ourselves or others into a place of attunement and cooperation. And so by walking through each phase, and on the screen we can see there's 4 phases. The first one being acknowledgement, the second one being awareness, the third being activation, and the fourth being ascension or expansion. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what each of those are. But generally, the way this model came was just really, I feel like it was dreamt through me or came through me as I was working with clients. Like, I don't know that I created it. It was this natural phenomenon that I was observing, which answered this question sort of how do we inhabit these times as adults. And so what I saw when I was working with clients was that they tended to like to hang out in one phase or 2 phases, but weren't necessarily doing all 4 of the phases, and it was causing different problems, both in their personal lives or in the collective. So what I mean by that is what I would see was that a lot of activists that I was working with liked to be in phase 1, which is acknowledgement, and then bounce over to activation. And they weren't doing a lot of sort of awareness work with their own emotional body, or even sometimes weren't doing the historical, sociological analysis that could help that. And so really just staying on a horizontal plane and bouncing back and forth between those, which tended to cause burnout and sometimes would cause a perpetuation of violence that they were actually trying to stop. And then the other thing that I observed when I was working with clients as a transpersonal counselor was people liked to hang out. I call them sort of the spiritualists rather than the activists, like to hang out in realms 2, which is the awareness phase and building somatic awareness and really kind of looking at their own process, doing personal development work. And then often they would bounce into phase 4, which is this ascension phase. And so they would really sort of do this inner work and then go to, well, and we're all one, so it doesn't really matter what happens on the earth plane, or, well, just look at the light. And they weren't really doing work on the horizontal plane or honoring sort of the human incarnation that we're all inhabiting when we're here. And so both, and that, what would happen is then they would stay in perpetual adolescence, really, and not add to the communal well-being. And so that's sort of how the model came to be. That's a sort of overview of it. And then I'm interested if you would be open to going through the phases and maybe even using a personal example.
Sure. Yeah,
Awesome.
Let's do that.
Great. So if we could bring up the first quadrant onto the screen, that is acknowledgement, we'll talk a little bit about it and maybe walk through something.
Yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah. So the first phase I call acknowledgement, and it's pretty simple. It just has to do with what's happening, what do I see, and really naming that. And so it often can just be, I see this, or I feel sad. And it seems like a small thing, but it's often the first act of reclamation for ourselves, or of really embodying where we're at and the times that we're in. And so sometimes all we have time for is acknowledgement, and that's better than nothing.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if you have an example that we could use to apply to this phase of acknowledgement.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of life here in Ashland, Oregon, and you know, just perhaps a moment of walking down the street and seeing a friend who maybe looks sad, looks like they're going through something. And I think in that moment I have the choice of whether to acknowledge that or just keep moving on, because I have my day to handle. So yeah, would it fit that my phase of acknowledgement would be just to stop and acknowledge, hey, how are you doing? It looks like, are you feeling sad right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this example. It's one of the simplest examples, I think, right? We're with a partner or a friend, and they look sad or mad, and we just simply say, like, I see you're sad, right? Or they're crying, like, I see you're crying.
Right.
That's an acknowledgement, and it sounds small, but often we don't do that. Often we'll just move on, or we know we don't have time to go further, so we ignore that. And we'll go into a collective or political example in the next episode. But on a large scale, that also means acknowledging what might be happening politically. So it could be acknowledging the school to prison pipeline and just saying, yeah, that's a thing, right? And when we have time, we'll go more into it. So is there any other questions you have about this phase or anything that would be helpful?
No, it moves me because I notice so often in our society going so fast-paced that often this step is skipped, just simply acknowledging each other, taking a moment out of our own agendas and our own rat race, so to speak, just to notice the other person. So I'm really appreciative of it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, in the next phase, if we want to pull up the second quadrant onto the screen, the next phase is called awareness. And so the quintessential example of phase one is like the news reporter, right? But I think we've all had the experience of too much acknowledged, like there's so much information and it's not necessarily getting integrated, or we're not able to build awareness around what this information is or what's happening around us. So the awareness phase really purposely goes down into the underworld because it often is exploring some difficult topics, such as grief. Like when we really acknowledge what's happening to families at the borders, for me, there's a ton of grief. Or if a friend is sad, right, we can build awareness around that, and that's difficult. Sometimes that's really uncomfortable. And so awareness also has kind of two parts to it in this model. One is an analysis. If we're talking about a political or collective example, especially doing some kind of historical analysis around that. But even in a personal example, we can also sort of, what facts do we have here? How do we go deeper into this? And then there's also a somatic, like an emotional somatic awareness that could be built that's really helpful. So I'm curious, with the example of your friend being sad, how you might build awareness around that.
Yeah, so in taking a moment to acknowledge my friend's sadness, I may take a historical context perspective and just kind of remember perhaps what that friend is going through. Like maybe they're moving, maybe they've had a relationship change. So I'm allowing myself to connect with what came before. And then I might also tune into my own body. Like, how does it feel to slow down out of my own agenda and connect with this friend? And maybe even in that awareness phase, I might even ask them. I might ask them how they're feeling as well, so that we're both attuning in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that, right? So a lot of this is, in the personal example, feels like, well, this is how you be a good friend or a good partner, right? Or a good therapist. And So yeah, some of the questions that I ask in this phase to people are, what's happening in your body? Or just simply tell me more, right? Tell me more is the quintessential phrase for this phase. And so anything that can really start to build curiosity, and then a term I like in this quadrant is deep discernment. So really being able to build the ability to discern what's needed from a place, from a rooted somatic place, and also an intellectual place, a place of having as much information as possible. Is there anything else in this phase that feels helpful to you, or questions before we move into the next one?
No, I do want to just celebrate the fact that there's a somatic piece and a historical context piece. Oftentimes in my own activism, I, in the past, have acknowledged something and then gone straight into activism without really taking a moment. And we'll dive more into this in the second episode when we talk about the immigration issues and the historical context, that this is not the first time that this has happened in our world. And so I'm really appreciating that in this phase there is the acknowledgement of the historical context. So I wanted to say that.
Yeah, and I really want to credit Adrienne Marie Brown and some of her work for that. And I know there's other people that have outlined different kind of allyship models that include that analysis phase. And really a part of this is not reinventing the wheel too, and really seeing what's already been out there, what organizations exist, things like that within this quadrant. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
The next phase is activation. And so if we could pull up the third phase, the third quadrant there, that has to do with activation, we can talk a little bit about it and what it is. It's important as we move into this phase to say that the activation is made through awareness. So it's right action towards whatever it is that we've built awareness around. We can then sort of say things like, well, so what's needed here? How do I protect my beloved? What is the best way to respond? And so in the example with your friend being sad, and you've now built awareness about why they're sad or what's happening for them and what's happening for you, I'm curious, like, what might be an example of activation? And of course it'll depend on why they're sad, but I'm curious if you have ideas around that.
Okay. So it's interesting because when you mentioned that the acknowledgement comes before this activation piece, without really knowing what's going on with my friend, I could take an action that's not in alignment with what they're needing. Like I could just go, oh, you look sad. I know that, maybe you need some food. They're like, no, actually I just ate. I'm going through a breakup. So I think tuning into my friend, knowing what they're going through and getting more information, then I can respond in this activation phase and perhaps invite them to tea if they're feeling lonely because they're going through a breakup or, something like that. But I really appreciate that it's informed by the acknowledgement.
Yeah. So perfect, right? Like an example of this in the activation phase is I've built awareness around what's going on in my body and my friend's body, and now I'm going to ask them if they want a hug, right? That's a way of activating towards them. So once we move out of that activation phase, we move into ascension or expansion, which is sort of this spiritual realm, and I find it happens really naturally, actually. I mean, there's ways we can work with this quadrant, such as meditation, but the truth is, if I've attuned to you or you've attuned to me, and then we hug, we're gonna feel more interconnected. We're gonna feel more expanded. And so if we can pull up the fourth quadrant of the model, we can just look at it for another minute. And what this does when we're kind of in that spiritual place, when we have that expanded sense of self, is then we're actually able to acknowledge more. And so this is when we see that who we are and who someone else is actually interwoven together. And so through that right action, we then genuinely feel this piece of interconnection that allows us to do more.
Totally.
Yeah.
I so appreciate going through all of these phases before getting to this ascension place. This ascension not being like the ultimate ascension, but it's just going to a new place in relationship with ourselves, relationship to the other. And so we have a community member, Desiree Continho, who has agreed to come onto the show and offer some of her spoken word poetry. And so I'm just really delighted to have Desiree on the show. And she's here for the first episode, but will be here more in depth for the second. So Desiree will take the stage now and offer us her poetry. And this is an example of someone going through the phases and being able to offer something for the community that's of value and really makes a difference. So thank you.
How do you weigh a heart to a feather when we live in a world like this? How do you trust that people get better when progress and power grow like a cancer? Wealth and glamour, a slanted story, a world where men build towers to worship their money but turn the working class into a culture of dummies. Because they sold us tickets to a ball game and a white picket fence. They sold our freedom in the name of defense. They sold our future to a few rich men. What does a guilty person look like anyway? Because I think we're in this ship together, so how do you weigh a heart to a feather? With a broken ode? A heavy load? Gold scales, loose brakes. Sorry, I left my nuclear waste in your basement. I'd like to blame the establishment, but it's my mess too. True, time is a patient teacher. She knows that human beings will make their choices. She knows that death is voiceless, but it will be those voices that rouse us from our sleeping. Ancestors who bring us to the very edge of the dreaming, the space between me and the problem. I'll tell you, somewhere far, a city has fallen. Tears are shedding for children. Men feel righteous for what they have done. Somewhere the sun is setting. A heart is telling the story of resistance again. Easy transgressions, we've buried our confessions under a concrete path because we live in the aftermath of war stories told in photographs. My will watches from the mountaintop, bombs drop, chemical attacks, makeshift shack where a family lives. Seated skies, melting ice, another headline to remind us, but the earth, she defies us with her silence. The sweat of death, a war for peace, fright in the eyes of an innocent. I'll take another, one more chance, please. I'll be in the dusty temple on my knees while the president tweets his success. I'll be praying on how they keep dirty hands so clean. Make an industry of ignorance. Keep the majority indifferent. Make war civil. Keep them out of our homes, adorned with wrong and right, a beast with an appetite to suffer. I've been asking the mother why, but she's quiet most of the time, and I don't blame her when it feels like nothing has changed. But maybe she'll teach me how to hold this anxious rage, let go these lead weights, because some days I feel like my hands are tied and I'm half blind, guessing at reasons why God would leave us in a mess like this. She reminds us with tenderness and weeping willows, rose hips collected in a jar, that my blessings travel somewhere far, that I can make a tonic with my loving. I can pray for ease, to disarm the disease, set down my weary doubt, be the seed that survives the drought. Serpents sleep at the base of your spine. They contemplate the changing skies. Time to wake now. Come alive. Weigh your heart to a feather. Tether it to love. Remember how to let your soft-bodied creature crawl. Remember how to land and how to fall. She begs us to be still, the mother she knows. To remember our forgetting is the antidote. She says, speak the word. I say, it's been spoken. She says, tell the truth. I say, I think the truth is broken. She says, well, be brave then. Be steady. Let your heart be heavy, be green shoots in spring rising from the murky depths. To let go your fear, let the darkness be felt. Let your heart be well. Be a dragon, breathing prayers. Because somewhere far, somewhere near, somewhere right here, there's something unfair.
Thank you so much to Desiree Continho for coming onto the show and showing us a live example of someone going through this model of radical attunement work. And with that, we're going to close this episode. This episode is the first of several where we address the current issues that are going on and learn what are some proactive steps that we can take as a community and how can we handle the stressors of the times that we're in. And so before we close, I just want to ask Holly, is there any last words that you'd like to say?
Yeah, so I would just say, thanks to Desiree for sharing that, and also thanks to the producer, Wanda Borland, and really excited to have people join us next time where Desiree will be having a conversation with us and walking through how to utilize this model from a political example or collective example. So just so thrilled to have this time with everybody and to be able to go through all of this. So I'm excited to see everybody next time.
Thank you.
When I was young, I believed what they told me. And when I was young, they really tried to mold me. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. They were confused, I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. I was confused, I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. When I was young, I was told the greatest story.